exists and is based at Old Warden in Bedfordshire.
And in addition to the vintage pair, I think we have at least 2 other chipmunks in the showground. The Portuguese chipmunk, regular visitor, but also in the centre of the showground where we have our nice arrangement of training aircraft throughout the years. Of course, you couldn't do that without a chipmunk. You just couldn't.
This aircraft was designed as a replacement for the de Havilland Tiger Moth biplane elementary trainer for both the RAF and the Royal Canadian Air Force, this being a product with Chipmunk of de Havilland's Canadian arm, but it was also to be produced by de Havilland at its plants in Britain, at Hatfield in Hertfordshire, and at Harden, which we were talking about earlier, the birthplace of the Battle of Britain Memorial Flights Lancaster, as well as there being production in Canada. It was designed by a Polish émigré, one Zivrod Jakimiuk, who was the chief engineer of de Havilland Canada. And Francis St Barb, who was a director of de Havilland here in the UK, is reported to have said to Jakimiuk, "If you can make a good trainer, I will sell it." And didn't he make good that promise? Around 1,280 of these aeroplanes ended up being built, most of them in the UK, but just over 215 of them in Canada, and 66 by OGMA, the Portuguese state aircraft factory. It was important that this aircraft be developed as cost effectively as possible because it first flew in 1946 in Toronto. Most governments at that time that were potential Chipmunk buyers to replace Tiger Moths and the like didn't have much money. We certainly didn't, to buy new trainers. There were lots of surplus trainers still available, left over from wartime. Lots of countries were effectively bankrupt after so many years of global hostilities. But nonetheless, this aircraft, this monoplane, as opposed to a biplane, found a very important market worldwide. And it was such a big advance over the Tiger Moth as well, because it had things like flaps and brakes and a radio and an enclosed cockpit, especially today. Well, it looks, much to my pleasure, as if they've actually got quite a lot of altitude.
Indeed.
And this is really going to be a display, as much as anything, of excellent energy management. 145 horsepower from one of the great British aero engines, the de Havilland Gypsy Major 8. And you can see them converting that height into energy for their initial manoeuvre. Pulling up into a very close formation loop. It's quite a while actually since I've seen a formation aerobatic Chipmunk display. Solo arrows, yes, but not in formation.
I think the last I remember were the Caledonian chipmunks, about 10-15 years ago.
Based up at Scotland,
Perth. We had them displayed at Lucas.
Yes, I've seen the likes of John Romain and Lee Proudfoot perform formation arrows in Chipmunks at Duxford, but this, as I say, a new departure for the vintage pair this year. An initial 3 loops. Turning slightly as they come up to the right-hand end of the display line, and of course maintaining close formation angle in low-powered aircraft like this is very challenging.
You can't just open the throttle and suddenly accelerate or hit the brakes and suddenly slow down. You've got to, in aviation we often talk about being ahead of the jet. We've certainly got to be ahead of the Gypsy here. If you think about what you need to do now, it's far, far too late.
Line of stern barrel rolls there, so named because they're basically describing the inside outline of the imaginary barrel positioned on the side of the sky. The first Chipmunk delivered to the RAF 75 years ago this year to the Oxford University Air Squadron at Kidwinton. And this type is still on RAF charge because the Battle of Britain Memorial flight at RAF Comics Fleet has two of these aircraft for tail dragger, conversion and refresher purposes. In fact, there are Chipmunks on the strength of all three of the historic flights, the military historic flights in Britain. Now, those two are the only ones still to register because the Navy, the Royal Navy historic flight is no more. Navy Wings Heritage Flight, they're represented here. They still have a Chipmunk, and we've got the historic Army aircraft flight Chipmunk, the Army Air Corps historic aircraft flight military, and here it's standing display.
And even in its primary role, certainly with University Air Squadrons and Air Experience flights, it stayed in service to the end of the 1990s. I mean, that's an incredible record.
Yeah, 1996 was when the final ones were retired by the AEF, at that stage in favour of the Scottish Aviation Bulldog, which also replaced them with the University Air Squadrons. And then, of course, now we have the Grand Future in this role. And they were still in service with the Army Air Corps until 1997. With their basic fixed-wing flight at Middle Wallop. But we mustn't forget the other roles Chipmunks played in RAF service. One of the most famous was clandestine photographic reconnaissance with the RAF Gatow station flight in what was then West Berlin. The Allies had the right to fly around the Berlin control zone, and they used the opportunity for reconnaissance with various helicopters, but also light aeroplanes like a fleet of Chipmunks. And one of the last Gatow station flight Chipmunks is one of the two with the Battle of Britain Memorial flight today. In towards us for a lovely crossing break. And nice to see two colour schemes represented here, Andy. The earlier silver with the yellow training bands and the later red and white.
Indeed, that's the red and whites for me is the sort of real characteristic colour scheme of these aircraft.
This is what I grew up seeing Chipmunks in flying to RAF Cosford, which also flying air cadets during the summer. It's a Walkmark colour. The Chipmunk was always a display aeroplane as they come in for a crossover. The havilland test pilot Pat Fillingham used to put on fantastic aerobatic displays of Chipmunks at Farnborough back in the 1950s, and there were later several display teams of them in the British military, the Blue Chips and the Skylarks in the RAF, and later my favourite was the Grey Owls of the Army Air Corps. So named because of the age of the pilots, who included some incredibly distinguished test pilots carrying on flying, but performing basic flying grading for the Army.
As was, of course, done on the Air Experience flights,
yeah,
of which this aircraft was a stalwart, obviously, where so many retired air officers would see out their careers instructing, taking cadets for their first experience. You sit next to Flying Officer Smith and you realise, no, it's Air Vice Marshal.
Yeah. I mentioned how it's still used by the BBMF, the Chipmunk, also, and represented by the one leading this pair here, still used by all sorts of civilian operations for much the same purpose as it has ever been used, providing elementary tailwheel training. And we've said this often about a few aircraft in today's show, but have you ever heard anyone say much of a bad word about the Chipmunk's handling?
Absolutely not, absolutely not. Certainly one of those aircraft that just had enough about it to keep it, to not let you get lured into a false sense of security, which is just what you want in a training aircraft.
Another very fine break right on the display datum. Yeah, that's the key thing, and that's something we'll come on to with the Harvard later. That is a terrible old cliche, I know, but easy to fly, difficult to fly well and accurately, but it is true.
Very true.
One of the Shuttleworth collection pilots, Richard Crockett, wrote that flying a Chipmunk is quite simply one of the most fantastic aviation experiences you can have, and quite a lot of people have compared it to being a mini Spitfire almost in some respects. One of the things I'm finding really impressive about this display, quite a lot of brakes, immediate and very snappy rejoins.
It's not just very well flown, it's been very well put together. There's a lot of thought gone into this.
Yeah. The Red and White aircraft in this pair was built at the de Havilland plant at Harden in Chester. Served with all sorts of units until its retirement in the second half of the 1990s. And there's a really good illustration in this aircraft of the sort of progression a pilot can undertake on an aeroplane such as this, because when it was retired from the RAF, it was bought by the Higgins family, and John Higgins, the number 2 in this team, who we've seen display at Cosford individually and in this pair several times, was at one stage the youngest holder in the UK of a display authorisation from the Civil Aviation Authority. He was aged just 20 when he got his first DA. He's now got several hundred hours on Chipmunks and must be one of the most seasoned Chipmunk display pilots in the country. And you'll see they're staying in close formation now as their sequence comes to an end, and I expect we're going to see a very nice close formation landing, and if it's anything like the landings I've seen them do as a pair at other events, it could well be a rather nice side-slipped formation landing.
It's certainly a very tight approach. I mentioned the Mustang making a curved fighter approach. There's good reason for that aircraft with the lack of forward view. I think the Chipmunk is the Chipmunk. The vintage pair are doing it as they can.
No, I didn't see that. But even the queue for that is just ridiculous at the moment. I'm just saying, I know, but here we come. Oh, nice. There you go. I know, I think I'm going to take your coat off now.
Well, I thought that was an absolutely splendid display by the vintage pair. David Petters in the lead, John Higgins, the number 2, with their pair of de Havilland Canada Chipmunk T10s. Utter nostalgia, but a wonderful display in the present day.